Now, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is just a dear friend, so I feel very excited and just a little emotive. Ivan Paz was raised in Fresno. Yes, yes. He's a longtime practitioner and leader there in his community. He serves at an interfaith organization that helps under-resourced communities organize for holistic flourishing. He is definitely a nerd. He is an adjunct professor at Fresno Pacific Biblical Seminary. I got to become friends with him and was so grateful to journey with him for 2 years because we were in a CCDA cohort together. So that was such a life-giving moment. And our nickname for him in there, that what captures what Ivan brings, is that he is a thugologian. So would you welcome my brother Ivan Paz to the stage?
In 1963, the US government sent 10 Special Forces personnel to El Salvador. Their goal was to help the Salvadoran general develop the nation's first civil defense system. This system was known as Orden, and it was composed of Army Reserve units and drafted citizens. Its purpose? To identify and eliminate communists among the rural population, lest they organize peasants to take control of land and industry, and then sabotage economic relations between the two countries. In practice, however, Orden became the country's first paramilitary death squad responsible for the kidnapping, torturing, raping, and killing of thousands of innocent people. In 1976, just 3 years before the Civil War kicked off in El Salvador, my mother said, "Basta, enough is enough." It was bad enough that there were absolutely no resources for survival. But when violence and sexual assault run rampant, you know it's time to go. Disgusted by the scene of street dogs eating the intestines of murdered bodies on the street, my mother held my older brother Walter in her arms, squeezed him in her tears, and decided to leave. She put him in the care of a relative until she could return for him. And against the many warnings from people in the village, my mom joined the waves of Central Americans on the dangerous journey to the US. She risked her life. She risked being attacked, raped, abducted, only to do it all over again after returning for Walter right when the Civil War kicked off. Now, this is my mother's story. I didn't even share my father's story of migration from Mexico. But what I will say is that what both stories have in common is this theme of resilience, the ability to overcome, not just to endure things like pressure or opposition or suffering or failure, but having the capacity to recover, bounce back up, and overthrow the forces against you. And if you are salvamecha like me, that's Salvadoran and Mexican, or if you're Mexican or Latino, your parents probably told you these kinds of stories over and over again, especially when they were trying to encourage you or scold you. Some of you know what I'm talking about, right? Nosotros no cruzamos montañas para que anden de vagos, right? We didn't cross mountains so that you can become delinquents, they would say. Our parents recounted these types of stories, nuancing them with biblical imagery as a way to empower us. For what? To advance against the obstacles of poverty, to resist the demonizing rhetoric against our people, and to trust in a God who promises not only to be crucified with us, but to resurrect with us as well. In other words, our parents sought to cultivate resilience in us. And while this must be appreciated and never disregarded, the truth is, resilience is always gained, never received. It is developed, not handed to you. I learned this the hard way. I'm going to be like my mom and illustrate this through storytelling. So I was born in LA, raised in Fresno, California. And when I was a kid, I had a big head. No, seriously, I literally had a big head. My sister says I still do. And with that head, I had a huge imagination. And with that imagination, creativity. I was a gifted kid with an impressive ability to draw. Check this out. I grew up in a house full of relatives, and while all my siblings and cousins would be playing outside, you know what I'd be doing? I'd be in my room, designing characters of stories that only existed in my mind. Gifted, borderline weird, big head. One of my teachers once asked me, Ivan, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I said, I want to work for Disney. Because when I was a kid, one of my favorite movies was Aladdin. And for a long time, I thought Aladdin was Latino, until my cousin told me, right? Until my cousin told me, nah, fool, he's Arabic. So I vowed that one day I would become the world's greatest artist, work for Disney, and create the first animated Disney character who happened to be Latino. Like Aladdin, I dreamed of jumping on a flying carpet to fly out of the slums, buy a palace for all of my family so that we would no longer have to live stuffed in 3 rooms. Big head, big imagination, big dreams. Then one day, my father was arrested and taken by ICE. I was just a kid. And the more I thought about it, the poverty, the sirens, the limitations set on my people, the more I felt an increasing chasm between me and my dreams. I didn't even put up a fight. The shame of poverty overcame me. The criminalization of my people undermined my respect for authority, and my hope in God dissipated. I quit dreaming. It wasn't long before I dropped out of middle school and turned to gangs, which plunged me into a series of incarcerations that began at the age of 12 and culminated with a 5-year prison term for gang violence at 19 years old. Prison is a dark place. I'm not gonna lie, I was scared. But at the same time, I was also excited. I mean, to build a reputation for your hood and then spend a 5-year shot in a high-security prison, a level 3? That's major respects on the streets. Think about it like this. It was kind of like the hood version of starting college for the first time. Far from home, not sure how you're gonna make it, but when you're done, you're gonna have honor. But after seeing a man get stabbed, another hang himself, and after almost being struck by a rubber bullet during a fight, I began to think, what did I get myself into? My mother always said, I crossed mountains and risked my life so that you wouldn't have to. Somehow I found myself at the foot of my own mountain, a mountain of fear and death. Then one night, God interrupted my life. I had been reading the Bible alone in my cell during a lockdown over a gang riot, and I couldn't help but reflect on the words of Jesus right before his arrest. He said, "Greater love has no more than this, but to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command." Instantly, the homies came to my mind. They'd often say, "I love you, dog. I'm willing to die for you, dog." And they kept their word. I mean, some got beat for me. My boy Patrick got shot in the back for me. Their love was 100, even though many times we were just trying to impress one another. Yet here, in this text, Jesus wasn't trying to impress anyone. He said, I'm going to lay down my life for you regardless. It was strange. Suddenly, those words went beyond the biblical text and the God of heaven was in my prison cell. He was talking to me, a violent criminal, and calling me his friend. I mean, I did a lot of bad things. So there was absolutely no reason why the God of holy people should be here with me in a prison cell. But here he was, present with me, his friend. I had no choice but to say, Lord, I will follow you wherever you lead me. Amen. Sometimes God comes into our lives and we feel ready for the world, even ready to lead in the hardest and darkest places. But hardship and opposition are real. And as a martial artist, I can truly tell you that if you haven't trained to resist and fail and recover from failure, you will easily get knocked out the moment you step into the ring. I thought I was ready for the world, but when the older homies found out I had been reading the Bible, later they asked me if I was going to be with them or with Jesus. I chose the homies. I wept that night. I felt like a coward. I came face to face with the reality that, like everyone else around me, I was powerless against fear. I was fear of being rejected by the homies, fear of dying in prison, fearful to follow Jesus because following Jesus seriously in a racially segregated prison context meant violence and death. It was much easier to pledge allegiance to the homies, adapt to the culture of violence, and read the Bible in secret under my covers. So that's what I did. Until I met Pastor Lance. Pastor Lance was a skinny guy, about 5.5 feet tall, half white, and Native American. He always had a huge smile, and he was known on the yard for gathering a bunch of inmates to perform in a Christmas choir every year. Imagine that. A Christmas choir full of buff, tatted up inmates singing Christmas songs. Pastor Lance was a lifer. He was serving a life sentence. I respected him. He inspired me. He mentored me. When I think about faith and resilience, there is no one else that can compete with Pastor Lance. He's been beaten, humiliated, and stabbed for boldly confronting racism and evil with God's love. So when he challenged me to trust God and sever ties with the gang, I did. And then my biggest fear happened. My gang put a green light on me, which means that whoever wanted to hurt me now could. 3 guys signed up for the job. I didn't come out of my cell for weeks. Then Pastor Lance came to my door and he told me to fast with him for 7 days. I thought he was a little crazy, but I did it anyway, and so I fasted, though I lasted only 3 days. And on the 7th day, Pastor Lance called me out of my cell. Despite the many warnings, I went out with him, and we silently walked together around the track 7 times, praying Psalm 23. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And on the 7th lap, something crazy happened. 3 fights broke out on the yard, the prison alarms went off, and everyone dropped to the ground. And when the officers finally took control of all of the violence, I saw each of the 3 men who were supposed to get me, now handcuffed with zip lines or zip ties, being escorted out of the yard, never to be seen again. I looked up to my mountain again. Suddenly, it wasn't so big. God, my friend, was with me. And I thought, if God is for me, who could be against me? Even if they killed me, I would live again. So there is no reason to live under the power of fear. It has been broken. Oh, death, where is your victory? Oh, death, where is your sting? So I took a deep breath, and against every warning, I sprinted up the hill, overcoming every obstacle that stood in my way, gang ties, depression, my lack of education. And when my time came to be released, many thought I would then falter. But God trained me. And with him, I continue to crash through many barriers. In the past 10 years, I've gone from streets to academics, from prison to professor, from gang member to community organizer, from single and sloppy to married and polished. All right? Thanks to my beautiful wife right here. Sometimes I feared, sometimes I fell. But with every fall, I got back up. And every time I got back up, I overcame. And every time I overcame, I became like my mother, like Pastor Lance, like Jesus, resilient. Today, I'm organizing several neighborhoods in Fresno that are connected to an avenue marked for revitalization. My main goal is to help residents and small business owners develop the kinds of neighborhood associations that would take lead in improving the quality of life in their neighborhood by steering the revitalization effort toward their own interests. Most of these neighborhoods have it rough, and many of its residents have been challenged by the current administration. But its people aren't helpless. The more I move between professional and peripheral spaces, the more I discover that resilience tends to be a normative characteristic among the poor. No wonder Jesus established his ministry in the ghetto. Right? There are many of you here today who resonate with my story. The mountains I described are your own. Immigration, the criminal justice system, racism, poverty, violence, and death. And we know that our stories aren't over yet. This American empire we live in continues to demonize our people, forcing them into poverty, locking them up for profit, shooting them down in the street, and deporting them to countries it turned into war zones. These people are our sisters, our brothers, our families, our neighbors. People like us have no choice but to resist. I am convinced that in these times of resistance, if there is anything needed the most, it is a church led by people like you. Resilience is about resisting and overcoming, and you can't effectively resist if you have not overcome your fears. How many times in the past years have we seen respected faith leaders flinch or submit in times of resistance? And they weren't even threatened with violence or exile. We need leaders who can overcome fear and cannot be intimidated, who've been without nothing so they ain't afraid to lose everything, who've learned to transform enemies into friends and pain into stamina so that the resistance endures till the end. Brother Cisco, where you at? Trishanda, Daniel, Ariana, Herman and Sarah, CCDA. You know who you are. You are overcomers. And it's people like you, I need to keep learning from, that we all need to keep learning from. This means that some of us will need to sit down and be humble. Right? That means that we need to create spaces for their leadership. And don't just merely create spaces for their voices at your table. Begin to learn how to actually follow their leadership at their table. Don't just listen, follow. And don't just follow, be mentored by them. How else will you learn to resist and flex the moral authority of the church in times of resistance? A book? A seminary degree? A ministry title? Nope. These are your teachers. And many of us have benefited from their moral courage and their leadership. Let them be like my mom to you. Let them be like Pastor Lance to you. Let them be like Jesus to you. So that together we could journey across the mountains of oppression, rise out of the ashes of violence, break the chains of fear and slavery, and become a resilient people who can live out the mission of Jesus against all the odds. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, fam, I feel like, just bawling on the side of the stage because I feel like Ivan is embodying and gifting us with so much. I want us to receive it. I always feel like in Christian context, we have to be so careful when people give us their story and we enjoy the story, but we don't fully let it transform us at the depth that it's supposed to. Especially thinking sometimes in the nonprofit world, we love a good prayer letter story, but sometimes we miss the prophetic word. And the thing that Ivan was saying that we have to hear, and particularly like me, I grew up in the suburbs. I grew up in a subdivision called Heatherstone. Like Ivan and I have different narratives. And when he says, like, some of us need to sit down and follow leadership, Ivan, I want to follow you. But I feel like it's so important that it's not just, I want to follow you and I also want to pay you. That there's this thing that happens sometimes where we follow people's leadership, but the people of color who are giving us that courageous moral courage aren't getting paid for that leadership. And then folks like me are. And there's a deeper systemic thing that goes on. I don't want us to just consume his story and not think about some of the deeper implications for us and the organizations, how we run them. So Ivan, I just feel so grateful for you, to learn from you and to sit at your feet, and for the others in our organization that are providing that leadership and teaching us about resilience. So can we just take a pause and take a moment to receive the gift that was given to us in that, and maybe the challenge, particularly for those of us who are in positions of power. I saw it's easy to give money, it's hard to give away power. So to rethink that, fam, to rethink that. Jesus, what's the invitation you have for us in Ivan's word today? Particularly for this group as CCD folk. Don't let us just hear the story really transform us. And for those who were calling out, who have to play that role among us from their own story to lead us in their moral courage, give us the humility, help us to sit down, help us to listen, to follow, to give away power and position, role and money. Amen. All right. I love being with you, fam.